now, we've arrived at the most famous woman of our world, Virginia Woolf. I don't think she needs much of an introduction, so we'll dive right in. But also, warnings for suicide attempts, child sexual abuse, and incest.
Poor woman. Right off the bat.
Born January 25th, 1882, to a pre Raphaelite art model mother and writer father, Virginia Stephen was one of the kids from her parents' second marriage. Both had outlived a previous spouse, so in addition to two brothers and an older sister, she had four older half siblings. She was the second youngest.
Wow. So, a big family.
Yes, but it was a rather normal middle class upbringing. Boys expected to be educated and choose careers, girls to marry, though in this case, the girls also had access to all their parents' books and so forth, as studying classical Greece was more for boys than for girls, usually.
Yeah, we know what happens when girls study ancient Greece, if you know what I mean.
What wasn't normal at all, though, was how long it took for Virginia to talk. It wasn't till she was 3.
Wow. Do we know why? Was there some sort of thing going on?
It's not mentioned in the biographies that I
Just
went through.
a statistical anomaly. Some kids are going to talk later. Right. So it's probably not a neurodivergence thing, or like a early trauma thing or anything like that. It could just be that's when she decided to talk.
No, the trauma comes later.
Great.
But before that, we have the usual sibling fighting, rivalry. They all slept in the nursery at the top of the house. Apparently, Virginia became the nightly storyteller.
I love it already.
Meanwhile, her mother worked occasionally as a nurse. She was gone frequently. It made her father anxious. He was giving lectures at colleges at the same time. Though he worried about money, they were never in danger of poverty.
So sounds about middle class.
Yes, but to add to the anxiety, her older half sister, Laura, wasn't all right. She was slow to read, had odd vocal mannerisms, was apparently not as responsive as expected or wanted, and chattered too much. Now, I am not a therapist or psychologist, so just my opinion, it sounds like she was autistic.
Yeah, no, it does. How did they address that at the time? It's probably not. I mean, even today, people have messed up understandings of autism. So, what was it like then?
Oh, she was just kept shut up in the house.
Love it. Love to see it. I'm sure she enjoyed that a lot.
I doubt anyone really asked her opinion. We do know that both parents, her father and her new stepmother, saw her differences as moral failings.
Great. So that sounds like a great house for Virginia to grow up in, where one of her siblings is just like being like actively disapproved of all the time.
There was also trouble with her other half siblings, the Duckworths, from her mother's previous marriage, but this is later on. Before those incidences, Virginia caught whooping cough, which apparently made her more introspective.
So I've heard that whooping cough can be like really bad for kids. Was this one of those cases?
It does sound like it.
Yeah, no, it sounds like a silly name for a disease, but like there's a reason that they give you that shot when you're a baby. It's because they do not want you to get it.
She and her full blooded siblings also made a newspaper, the Hyde Park Gate News. It covered the goings on around the house.
That's very cute. Who was the audience for it?
Their parents, mainly. Now, this isn't to say that they were always close. Virginia was closer with her older brother and sister, Toby and Vanessa, and not with her younger brother, Adrian. She kinda ignored him.
Why?
This might be because he was their mother's favorite.
Oof.
Likewise, she wasn't close to her half siblings. The oldest of them was 14 years older than her, and age gaps are just huge when you're young. So you can
Mm.
imagine a lack of talking and interacting. Laura was, as we noted, basically shut up in the house, but her Duckworth siblings were also rather conventional. compared to her and her full-blooded siblings.
Now, what does that mean?
While Stella dismissed Ibsen as a bunch of mad ravings, and Gerald and George were typical uptight Victorians.
Gotcha. So it's just a different vibe from them than the rest of the family.
Yes, especially when you take into account what the Stephen siblings would be doing later on, especially
Mhm.
Vanessa and Virginia. Now, this difference wasn't helped by the sexual abuse.
Cool. We got to that part.
It's said that when Virginia was about 6, Gerald lifted her to stand on a dining room table and explored her body. Some blame this for her later eating problems, because why would you eat at a dining room table if such things occurred to you on a dining room table?
Yeah. No. Understandable. And I mean, even without that literal connection, you do hear about a lot of people with eating disorders having them because of sexual abuse previously, that they have a complicated relationship with their body.
It's interesting you mention eating disorder because that theory comes up later, but again, that's for a later time.
Mhm.
Back to her childhood, matters were not helped when her mother died of heart failure due to influenza in 1895.
Mm.
Virginia was only 13.
So that's gotta affect her as well.
Yes, now, while she was closer to her father, meaning he was her favorite parent, this was still a blow. As she would later say, her death was the greatest disaster that could happen. Some also point to this as the beginning of her madness. So, for instance, Stella came up to the nursery later to talk about things because she noticed that Virginia was afraid. She writes, "When Stella asked me to forgive her for having given me that shock, I cried. We had been crying off and on all day, and said, 'When I see mother, I see a man sitting with her.' Stella looked at me as if I had frightened her."
So was this a hallucination?
It kind of sounds like it, but this is also written years later. Who knows how memories get twisted in the mind? It could have combined stuff with her breakdown. That being said, she did basically have the first mental breakdown here.
So what is a mental breakdown in this instance? What does this look like?
All of her breakdowns seem to have had a great deal of, well, hallucinations as part of it. But this one, I can't entirely tell you how this one went because it's been glossed over more. Like the
Mhm.
first in depth look at breakdowns comes with her second mental breakdown. We do know there's a great deal of confusion about her feelings and that she pretty much doesn't write or take lessons or do much of anything for 2 years.
Wow. So this is not just a single like day or week where she's freaking out. This is a protracted period of not being well.
Correct. This is probably not helped by her father being more melodramatic in his grief. He apparently made everyone feel like no one could mourn her but him.
Oof, that is not a good thing, especially with that many children. Like that's not healthy.
Her half sister Stella pretty much took over the role of caregiver now. But in 1897, Stella died when she came back from her honeymoon.
Wow. So and that's only 2 years later.
Yes, she may have had inflammation of the intestines, but it wasn't treated for 3 months.
That is rough.
At the same time, 15-year-old Virginia was not well and was anxious, and
Really?
this second
Sorry.
death was also catastrophic.
One would imagine she keeps on having these, authority figures and kind of protector figures dying on her, especially since that sexual abuse. I don't know if that happened the one time or if that was recurrent, but I imagine she would feel unsafe in her own home, and having authority figures who were safe would probably mean a lot in that case, especially.
Everyone basically retreated into their own thing. In her case, it was studying Greek.
So where before they were more of a cohesive unit, they kind of separated out now. Can see that being a big change in a family dynamic.
A brief bright spot came in the form of a woman called Madge. a writer who grew up in the Swiss mountains. According to her nephew Quentin, Virginia fell in love with her at the time.
How do they know each other?
Social interactions, she knew one of her Stephen relatives.
Ah, came into her.
Yes, because they're still having a social life. It's not like the house is completely shut down.
Right, they're just weird and fragmented and trying to pick up the pieces. Ah, this is so sad.
Now, in the case of Madge, nothing came of this.
But Virginia now knows a particular thing about herself.
Perhaps. The more impactful thing is that George Duckworth becomes more involved in their lives. So he'd accompany her and Vanessa to social gatherings and outings, but he would also do things like go into Virginia's room when she was changing and fondling her.
No, excuse me. Also, isn't this the other one? So both of those brothers are abusing her now. Like, also, aren't these the Victorian ones? Like,
Just because you can be a very uptight Victorian doesn't mean you can't be a hypocrite.
I did her family know about this at all? Did she tell anyone?
It comes to light later. And now, as for the George Duckworth being involved, biographies differ on timelines. This may have even occurred before Stella died.
Love it. I mean, regardless, definitely taking advantage of family disorder and her being younger and having less power. So, great guy.
There was drama as well between her sister Vanessa and Stella's widowed husband Jack Hills, who still visited them.
Oh no, and by drama, you mean?
At the time, it was the height of scandal for a man to marry his deceased wife's sister.
I mean, even today, I can see people talking about that sort of thing.
So there was a flurry of outraged relatives enlisting Virginia and trying to get Vanessa away from him.
Did it work?
Well, Vanessa never married him. Add to this, though, that she was being a thorn in George's side for not conforming to society.
Wow. Wow. Come on, dude.
While both sisters thought of him as a bore.
Among other things.
Now, amidst this 7 years of turmoil and unhappiness, she also met Violet Dickinson, an older woman who encouraged her to write and with whom she had playfully erotic correspondence.
So that's good having some control over her sexuality.
And then her father died in 1904.
Come on. Can she have nothing?
She can have something because at 22 she had a nervous breakdown.
I mean, nothing good.
Her sister Vanessa then mentioned the events that occurred with their half brother George, along with the everybody dying trauma, to the doctor.
Does this have consequences? Because this sounds like they're gonna try to put her away somewhere.
She isn't mad. She does recover from this, but going into what is actually wrong with Virginia, whatever it was, came back 5 times in her life, 4 of which occurred between the ages of 13 and 33. There would be headaches, fever, reluctance to eat, even weight loss. Now, one biographer notes it sounds like anorexia nervosa, but that doesn't fit because she wasn't obsessed with her body, which is the main part of that condition. Sometimes there were also hallucinations and speaking gibberish. The famous incident of her thinking King Edward VII is muttering obscenities in the azalea bushes.
Gotcha. So, do we have any idea of what this could be?
There are numerous theories. So, a bit more about how it usually went. There are 2 distinct stages, it is said. In the manic stage, she was extremely excited. The mind raced. She talked a whole lot, and at the height of the attack, incoherently. She had delusions and heard voices. She could be violent with her nurses. At one point in one breakdown, she actually ended up in a coma for 2 days. And then during the depressive stage, all her thoughts and emotions were the exact opposite of what they had been in the manic stage. She was in the depths of melancholia and despair. She scarcely spoke, refused to eat, refused to believe that she was ill, and insisted that her condition was due to her own guilt. and it is at the height of this stage that she usually tried to commit suicide.
Wow. Ouch. Poor woman.
Now, it has also been suggested that the hallucinations could have come from the medications she was given and then was weaned off of during these episodes. For instance, she was given chloral hydrate and then had the dose decreased over time. This theory is mainly because the drug is considered a sleep inducing hypnotic like alcohol and modern Valium.
So, does it produce hallucinations in other people?
That is why it has been suggested.
Hallucinations are not actually part of her thing. They're part of the treatment.
A side effect.
So what does she have?
Well, it is very difficult to diagnose someone from beyond the grave. So, theories include bipolar disorder, chronic febrile illness, tubercular illness, the catch all hysteria, genetics, trauma, both, etc., etc. But really, no one knows what was wrong with her. I'll throw in my 2 cents and say it might have been multiple things.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, you definitely can't discount the trauma, but that wouldn't be all of it.
Well, part of the reason I say multiple things has to do with descriptions of how she handled later bouts of illness. So, in 1926, an attack of German measles knocked her out for the summer. In 1927, the usual flu and headaches put her to bed. In 1923, they found pneumonia germs in her throat, and she is now being inoculated once a week with some 50 million of them. All through the 1930s, there are symptoms of fevers, faints, headaches, jumping pulse, and insomnia. And the thing is, she's not particularly old when the flu comes, and flu doesn't usually knock out a young person so easily.
So you're saying her system is already prone to whatever this is, that she doesn't have the natural defenses against these seasonal diseases.
Possibly. The mind and the body are very interconnected. What affects one affects the other. So, a mental problem combined with physical health problems or a weaker than normal immune system doesn't sound far fetched.
Yes. You wonder with the whooping cough if that might have had some long-term effect on her immune system or on the way that her body dealt with illness.
It's possible. Either way, there was some sort of suicide attempt during the 1904 breakdown. Obviously, she survived. It was apparently a very low window she jumped out of. Of course, contracting scarlet fever at the same time didn't help.
That just is not a good time for her.
Now, after dealing with all of this and being declared cured, Virginia and her full siblings moved, shocking everyone, to Bloomsbury. See,
Shocking everyone why.
their relatives did not consider it a desirable address. The opposite, in fact.
Oh, scandalous.
By now, George is married and Gerald is elsewhere, so no more dealing with them frequently. I assume for their half sister Laura, since she doesn't die till World War II, that she is either in the care of an institution or some other relatives, as she isn't really mentioned.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Just shove her in a closet somewhere and ignore her.
Either way, they are now free from Victorian staidness to a large extent. It is the time to throw convention out of the window. Her social life was still awkward, though people were now showing up, like her brother Toby's friends, Clive Bell and Linton Strachey. To celebrate her freedom, she also started smoking cigarettes, scandalous for the time. And as it turns out, all of these people were just as confused about what to do with their lives as I am.
As a lot of us are.
No one knew what to do after education. Strachey failed a fellowship, Bell took up French painting, Maynard Keynes couldn't decide whether to be an academic or a civil servant, and Leonard Woolf was depressed heading for what we know today as Sri Lanka.
Leonard Woolf. Now that name is familiar.
Yes, in his case, he had dinner with Toby and his siblings, including Virginia, before he left, so that's how they meet initially.
Hmm. And she thinks, the love of my life.
No, Virginia was initially unimpressed with them all.
Hmm.
She described them as shabby, ugly, ungracious, sitting for hours in complete silence and only talking when truth or beauty was under debate.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd hang out with them either.
The more time she spent around them, the more she decided that she would be a great writer, and not them. With the help of Violet Dickinson, she got her first professional writing gig, a review for the women's supplement of an Anglo Catholic newspaper. This led to other articles. She also became a voluntary unpaid teacher at Morley College for 2 years.
Ah, the unpaid internship, my favorite.
Then, as time went on, basically all of the Bloomsbury men proposed to her.
Wow. Typical.
But this family also couldn't escape catastrophe.
Excuse me? So far they haven't been able to.
In 1906, the siblings, along with Violet Dickinson, took a trip to Greece after Vanessa rejected Clive Bell's marriage proposal.
Oh, so Vanessa's getting proposed to left and right too.
Virginia wasn't well on the trip, forced to deal with sick rooms and foreign contradictory doctors. The first said she had appendicitis, the second hysterics, and the third just wanted to give her ice packs.
So wildly contradictory, yeah.
The first doctor was right.
Oh, oof. That would be a major thing to not treat immediately.
So while that was being dealt with, her older brother, Toby, returned to London ahead of them. When they arrived, they found him abed with diarrhea and a high fever. Doctors initially said he had malaria. 10 days later, they realized it was typhoid fever. Now, in the doctor's defense, the two are similar and can be often confused for each other.
Still. Oof. Is he alright?
Well, during this period, Clive Bell came around, Violet fell ill, and then Toby was operated on in November, but he died 3 days later.
Wow. As if they haven't had enough death in the family.
And this is followed by Vanessa deciding to marry Clive 2 days after her brother died. Virginia didn't tell Violet about Toby for a month, instead lying with daily progress reports. The only really good part about all of this is that Virginia didn't have a breakdown.
Wow, and she would have been justified. I mean, yet another member of her family dying, and then also her sister's going to leave to get married. So, kind of what family unit they had is breaking apart.
Yes, Vanessa and Clive get married in 1907. By July, Vanessa is pregnant. Virginia feels very alone at this point.
No, really.
She then starts debating whether she would ever have children. So there's points where she's wondering the world might perhaps be considerably poorer if the great writers had exchanged their books for children of flesh and blood. Things like how remaining a child meant not to have a child, if marriage and children were not for her. Her role, as she was acutely aware, was fixed. She wrote to her favorite spinster as a virgin, an aunt, an authoress. More bad news followed, though.
What? Come on, she's already had enough.
Virginia now has to live with Adrian, the brother she isn't close to, their mother's favorite, the baby of the family. They don't get on well.
Wow. So she is going to be with family, but it's the wrong family.
This is probably not helped by the fact the house they moved to is in a seedier part of town. Violet, anxious about propriety, didn't visit for a time, so that friendship is now withering on the vine.
Wow, so she's even more alone.
At the same time, things are shaking up in Bloomsbury. Talk freed up, sex was no longer censored around Virginia and Vanessa, and new people fell into orbit. And this includes Ottoline Morrel, who, when they first came to know each other, Vanessa had asked teasingly and inaccurately whether Virginia should treat Ottoline as a rival, saying, "You will have a desperate liaison with her, I believe, for I." rather think she shares your sapphic tendencies and only wants a little encouragement.
Ooh. Wait, so Vanessa knows?
The two are rather close.
Mhm. Is Virginia out to anyone else?
I think that's a rather inaccurate term to use, as Virginia Woolf never described herself as a lesbian or a sapphist, really, not in earnest.
Gotcha. She was just known by her sister.
Now, while everyone else was playing the game of who's in whose bed, Virginia was off on the sidelines.
Mhm.
She was perceived as the cold, chaste Virginia the Virgin, who never does anything at all sexual or sensual. For instance, when Strachey fell in love with George Mallory, he said the only person who would feel sympathy is Virginia, because, as he said, I'm a convert to the divinity of virginity. While all this was going on, Virginia was writing to Violet Dickinson about masturbation.
Nice. So wait, so is she a lesbian?
I find it rather difficult to stick a label on dead women, even more so in this instance, due to not knowing how sexual trauma messes with a person's head.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
And speaking of confusion, as biographer Hermione Lee puts it, Virginia spent her 20s very confused between writing joking letters to female friends while having no outlet for anything she felt towards women. Meanwhile, there is the expectation of marriage hanging over her head that even she had for herself to a lesser extent. As mentioned earlier, she was proposed to several times. Once by a future politician, Edward Young, on a day at a football, what Americans call soccer, match. Another was an ambassador to Athens, Sidney Waterlow, who was in the middle of a dying marriage and disastrous affair, but he actually called Virginia sensual, saying she was more emotional and interested in life than in beauty, while Vanessa was icy, cynical, and artistic.
And we all know that the way to a woman's heart is comparing her to her sister.
Well, this man is actually the only one to remain a friend. There was also an almost love triangle with her brother in law, Clive Bell. This was helped along by the fact Vanessa gave birth to her first son in 1908, so her and Clive's sex lives were interrupted.
And obviously that is Vanessa's problem, and Clive, needs to find a way to solve that problem.
When Virginia visited, he said he wanted to kiss her.
And she's like, "Excuse me?"
Well, yes and no. Nothing actually happened, though. And
Yeah,
Vanessa
good.
was aware.
Was she all right with it?
It's complicated, but the two remain close.
Good, good. I'm glad this isn't driving a wedge. That's just such a presumptuous thing on his part.
At the end of 1908, there was speculation of Virginia marrying Linton Strachey. As he told it, he realized as he was proposing that such a marriage would be the death of him, and then became terrified that she would kiss him. By the end of the conversation, he managed to get out of it.
Hmm.
And now we should note there is no account of any of this from her.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see her take on this whole situation. But in any case, I'm glad they didn't end up getting married because that would not be an auspicious beginning.
Virginia was now becoming comfortable with the idea of remaining single, unaware that Strachey was writing to Leonard Woolf about her.
Why? Why stretchy?
In 1911, Woolf would return from Sri Lanka. By then, Virginia had been drawn into women's suffrage. She was writing letters about it to friends.
Because as we all know, it's the sapphic to suffrage pipeline.
At the same time, there was the Dreadnought hoax.
Ooh, that sounds like a sci-fi thriller.
It's not a sci fi thriller, it is. Well, you see, Bloomsbury decided on a lark to pretend that the Sultan of Zanzibar would pay the British Navy a visit. Virginia was dragged in at the last minute as Prince Mendax. They practiced Swahili, and it was only by luck that the crew member who spoke it wasn't there that day.
Yeah, close shave.
It was blown up into this whole planned out conspiracy thing by the newspapers.
Really, it was just like a group of friends doing a prank.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of YouTubers, and TikTokers.
Yeah, no, people is the same.
Other adventures include possibly going skinny dipping with the poet Rupert Brooke, who would die in World War One. Brooke himself would turn against the Bloomsbury Group before then in a breakdown in 1912. Now, Leonard Woolf had a year's leave from Sri Lanka. Vanessa, Clive, and Strachey were encouraging his courting Virginia.
Why?
They approved. They thought it would work out.
Mhm.
Either way, it was an intense time. She was trying to finish a novel. He actually read it as she went and encouraged her while trying to decide if he would return to Sri Lanka. In December, he moved into a bedroom on the fourth floor of the house she shared with Adrian. He then proposed in January 1912.
So, do we have her account of this whole time? I mean, was he just like bothering her? Or was she into him? Or what?
Well, you see, she asked for time to decide, while he asked for extended leave from his job. When his leave wasn't extended, he resigned, and at the beginning of May, Virginia decided she did not want to marry him.
But she's gonna.
Well, she changed her mind by the end of the month. They then married on August 10th, when she was 30 and he was almost 32, and the honeymoon was across France, Spain, and Italy.
Does she write about him during this time? Do we have any sense of her feelings on the matter?
Leonard Woolf's obvious suitability as a husband was both an attraction to Virginia and an obstacle. He was the right age, he belonged to her extended family of friends. He had loved Toby, and he was the closest friend of her closest friends. However, at the same time, he was a stranger who had been living a very different life on a different continent.
So none of that speaks to desire or affection? Is this like one of those pacts? Well, if we're both 30 and neither of us have married, then I guess.
It's very confusing.
Mhm.
So at one point she wrote, "Now I only ask for someone to make me vehement, and then I'll marry him." So it seems like she was very conflicted, and I don't think the pressure she even put on herself to marry was helping. So at one point, she also wrote, "Of course, I can't explain what I feel. These are some of the things that strike me. The obvious advantages of marriage stand in my way, I say to myself. Anyhow, you'll be quite happy with him, and he will give you companionship, children, and a busy life. Then I say, by God, I will not look upon marriage as a profession. Then, of course, I feel angry sometimes at the strength of your desire. Possibly your being a Jew comes in at this point. You seem so foreign.
Okay, that's a little bit anti-Semitism sprinkled in for fun.
And then I am fearfully unstable. I pass from hot to cold in an instant without any reason, except that I believe sheer physical effort and exhaustion influence me. Again, I want everything: love, children, adventure, intimacy, work. Can you make any sense out of this ramble? I am putting down one thing after another. So I go from being half in love with you and wanting you to be with me always, and know everything about me, to the extreme of wildness and aloofness. I sometimes think that if I married you, I could have everything, and then, is it the sexual side of it that comes between us? As I told you brutally the other day, I feel no physical attraction in you."
So there you are. It's one of those Gellhorn situations.
But either way, in the end, they do marry. However, their finances were not well. Leonard did take a job, and there was no evidence also that Virginia would be a money coming in writer. Though, we should note, her brother Gerald had a printing press and agreed to print her first book, The Voyage Out.
The least he could do.
Yes, this book she had edited after the wedding, and it was now delivered for publication. It would come out in 1915.
Ah, so there's some chance of success.
Unfortunately, this was overshadowed.
Aren't there enough unfortunatelies in her life so far?
She had another breakdown. There was no eating or sleeping, the delusions were upon her again. Even worse, Leonard left his sleeping pills out from under lock and key. She took them. She then had to be rushed to the hospital with a stomach pump when she got there.
Ouch. That, from what I've heard, that is one of the worst experiences you can have having your stomach pumped.
Perhaps in light of this is why Leonard agreed with doctors that it would be too dangerous for him and Virginia to have children.
Yeah, no, I mean the pregnancy hormones do a lot to your mental health already, depending on how your brain is wired. B, imagine trying to care for kids in the midst of that.
So Leonard managed to persuade her to agree, even though they both wanted children. As her nephew Quentin Bell writes, in this I imagine that Leonard was right. It is hard to imagine Virginia as a mother, but it was to be a permanent source of grief to her, and in later years she could never think of Vanessa's fruitful state without misery and envy.
Oh, yeah. No, I can imagine that sense of if she didn't have to deal with all of that, that she probably would have been a mother and would have enjoyed that.
And that is, unfortunately, where we leave our heroine for this month. As many of you are aware, this woman had a lot going on in her life, and it can't be shoved into just one episode.
At least she's published.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe, and remember, modern medicine is a lot better, so go get therapy.